When I came, I asked the president, which university produces town planners in this country? And she said, it's University of Moratuwa. I was happy because I'm also from University of Moratuwa. I did engineering, I did electronics and telecommunication engineering at University of Moratuwa. And we had a lot of friends in the Department of Architecture. And I think perhaps some of my batchmates must also be here. Something that I want to pick from the presentations I heard was your keenness to contribute towards the economic development of the country. But we all know, as at now, economy is not a good word in this country. It is not something that we can be very proud of. Not only as a minister, but as a citizen of this country, as a professional of this country. I'm ashamed that we are in the current crisis. Because if you look at the countries that are going through really bad economic situations in the world today, amongst them you find Argentina, Venezuela, Sudan, Libya, and it is said that we are also in that club. So it's important, I think, we all reflect how we arrived here. In a way, to do so, we have to discuss politics a little bit. Sometimes politics is a subject that professionals don't want to talk about. I was in the private sector for 20 years. I worked in Sri Lanka as well as abroad. Those days, I was also one of those usual professionals who used to say we are not interested in politics. But later I came across a nice statement by the famous poet Bertolt Brecht. I'm sure all of you have heard. He speaks about professionals who are politically illiterate. If I remember his words, he says the worst illiterate in this world is the professional who doesn't understand politics. And he explains why. He says this fool, use the word used, this fool, this professional, the fool who takes pride in saying that I'm not interested in politics, doesn't understand the cost of living, the price of bread, the price of flour, price of everything is decided by the politicians. So if you don't understand politics, you don't understand why you're in this mess. So if you say, if you are in a mess today, we need to first of all understand politics and how it all happened. So I thought, rather than talking about town planning, that you all know, or urban development, that again something that you know, I will talk a little bit about the current economic situation in the country. Because that is something I believe as professionals, you must be aware of. That sometimes we are very shallow in making our decisions. We just go through Facebook or some social media, look at something that we read and make judgments. Not only we make judgments, we comment with very little knowledge of what's going on. And we think we know everything. That's the saddest part. What is the problem that country is facing today? Obviously, all of you know, if you simplify that, we have a foreign currency issue. The foreign currency issue is because of a debt crisis that we have got into. But how did this debt become a crisis? Is debt a bad thing? Is national debt a bad thing? I don't think so. If you look at all the developed countries in this world, they have very high debts. Most of the developed countries have a debt to GDP ratio more than 100%. If you take a country like Japan, but 200%. So it is not a bad thing. Borrowing is not a bad thing. All of you in your lives borrow, don't you? When you start your career, early days particularly, you may have borrowed money to buy your car. You may have borrowed money to build your house. You may have borrowed money to start a business. You may have borrowed money to develop that business. So there's nothing wrong in a country also borrowing. But the problem is, when you do not generate sufficient money to pay back what you have borrowed, it's a problem. This is something that we need to understand. Say you start your career, you go to the bank, borrow some money to build a house. And when you borrow that money, you go for a long-term loan, maybe 20 years, 25 years. Over that long period, gradually your income will grow, your money inflow will increase, and since you are paying in small quantities every month, every year, over that period, you can pay that money. And after a while, you have now sufficient income to borrow more. You borrow more to buy your vehicle. You borrow more to do your business. So long-term borrowings is not at all a problem. For a country also, if you borrow long-term money, it is not a big problem. So if you look at Sri Lanka's debt history, until about 1990s, we had debt, but almost everything was based on concessionary loans. They were coming from various foreign governments or foreign institutes like World Bank, ADB or JICA. They had about 25 years, 30 years payback period. Interest as low as perhaps 1%, 1.5%. So they were never a problem. To build Mahavali, we borrowed heavily. In fact, when it came to 1989, as far back as 1989, out of our total debt, 62% were foreign debt. Today we are talking of more or less the same figures, and we are today talking about a crisis. But at that time, when the foreign debt component was 62% of the total debt, nobody said it was a crisis because we had sufficient time to pay back. But the problem started when we shifted from these long-term loans to short-term loans, or rather commercial borrowings. Go back to your story. If you borrow money to build a house, which you have to pay back in 5 years, and if you do not have sufficient money to pay back that loan, then you are in a crisis. That is why normally when you borrow short-term commercial loans, you normally borrow for the purpose of investment. Normally you borrow, that's why you call commercial borrowings. You borrow and invest. You generate money to pay back. But Sri Lanka also went into commercial borrowings starting from 2007. That was the first time we went for an international sovereign bond issue, 500 million. There was a reason for that. The reason was we were fighting a war. We won the war in 2009. That was the time we were fighting a war. War has started, it was getting escalated, and no foreign government was funding the war. Nobody was giving us money to buy equipment. So we had to, at that time, go for a commercial loan. I think if I remember correct, something like very high, about 6% of whatever interest, I can't remember the exact figure, but a high interest commercial loan. And then 2009 war ended. After that, the development process started. At that time, the government thought, okay, let's borrow some money to support the development activities. So 2009, another 500 million was borrowed. International sovereign bonds. And then from that onwards, things started continuing. Every year or so, we were borrowing money through international sovereign bonds. So now these are not long-term loans. Actually, we were not getting concessional loans after 1990s because we had now, by that time, got ourselves elevated to what we call middle income status. We were reaching there. So we were not getting concessional loans. We had to go for commercial borrowing. The problem was we kept on borrowing and we kept on investing into development activities, and actually we were building highways, we were building ports, we were building airports, no problem because we were having physical assets. But the problem is these things are not generating money, or rather we were not really focusing on how to generate money. The foreign direct investment were coming very slow. Factories were not coming up. Businesses were not coming up. So we were building infrastructure, much needed infrastructure though. Nobody can say these are not required. Because of the war situation for 30 years, our development had got halted. So we had to build those things. We had to give people electricity, we had to give people water, we had to give people highways, roads, access. They were required. But somewhere we missed out was the money was not going into real income generating assets. Then when it came to 2014, the government changed. When the government changed, the government that came to power were severely critical of the borrowings of the previous government, you may remember. They were talking about a debt trap. A lot of people wouldn't have understood at that time, the way you understand today. That government was talking about a debt trap, complaining that the previous government has got us involved in debt trap, we have to get out. But interestingly, or sadly, what happened was they never got us out of the debt trap. They got us deeper into the debt trap over the next 5 years. What did they do? From 2009 until 2014, international sovereign bonds, we had issued up to $5 billion. $5 billion. Now these sovereign bonds, you have to pay within either 5 years or 10 years. The problem with a sovereign bond as opposed to a long-term loan, it's a long-term loan, you pay in small portions over a very long period. A sovereign bond, after 5 years, let's say, after a very short period, you have to pay back in full. If you borrowed $1,000 million for 5 years, after 5 years you have to pay $1,000 million at once, in addition to paying the capital over that 5-year period. Now this government, which came to power in 2015, borrowed how much you think? Over the next 5 years, 12.5 billion through international sovereign bonds. More than double what the previous government borrowed. Then comes the question, why? Some people argue and say they had to borrow, they had no option, because the previous borrowings, now they had to settle during that period. Yes and no. There's a truth in it. Some things had to be settled. But if you really look at, you cannot really justify, because if you look at the sovereign bonds that were borrowed from 2009 up till 2015, out of those only 3 bonds, 2 500 million bonds and 1,000 billion bond was settled during that period. So that is only 2 billion. So you don't need 12 billion to settle 2 billion. But then of course there were long-term loans to be settled, which are coming over a long period of time. They settled about 9 billion there. So now it's answered. The 12 billion would have been spent on that. But if you go back, the previous government also had to pay like that. They in fact, during their period, 2009 until 2014 period, they had paid something like 12 billion. So nothing different. Both governments had faced more or less the same problem. Both governments had more or less done the same mistake of continuously borrowing and not investing that money into money generating assets. If you look at exports, don't think I'm trying to be critical of the last government. This is a problem that I have to highlight, which is a common problem that was coming over the last 3 decades. The last 5 years in particular, the exports didn't grow. In 2014, the exports of this country was something like just over 11 billion, something like 11.1 billion. After 5 years, it was at about 11.8 billion. The growth was virtually not there. Over a period of 5 years, the exports had grown only by about 7%. Now this is not good enough for a country. Now, the debt to GDP ratio, if you take the foreign debts, in 2014, it was something like 30%. By 2019, it had grown to 42%. The reason was the GDP growth rate had got slowed down. If you take 2005-2014 period, GDP grew by about 4 times, from $20 billion to 80 billion, 79 point something. But thereafter, the projection was by 2020, we should have reached something like 122 billion. But that forecast was never achieved. We ended at about 81 billion. That is where the problem was. The growth had not come. Debt has increased. So now we had a problem. Debt had to be continually served, but income was not coming forth. Now what is the situation in 2020? 2020 and 2021, we had to settle something to the value of about $11 billion as debts. 5 billion in 1 year, 6 billion in the other year. Now, how do you settle this debt? That is where the problem was. If you look at our current account, our inflow and outflow of foreign currency, our exports, goods basically, is something like per annum about 10 billion. Our imports, something like 20 billion. So there's always a gap of about 10 billion. But if you look at our service exports, like the tourism, IT, then like foreign remittances, they bring us about another 10 billion or so. So we always balance exports, the inflow and outflow somehow manage. The problem is debts. Now we had 11 billion debts to be settled, but for that we didn't have savings. We had only 7.6 billion savings in the kitty. So obviously that saving has to be spent to settle the debt, and on top of that there was another problem. The corona hit the country and this tourism income came down. Annually we were getting something like $3 billion from tourism. When we came to power, we were expecting that to grow over the next, let's say 5-year period, about $10 billion. Instead of growing, it virtually disappeared. So over the next 2 years, we lost about $6 billion of opportunity from tourism. That is where the problem arose. Now you can understand the numbers. There's no point blaming anybody. The reality is we had to settle our debts. We were not having sufficient money, and today we are in this situation. We simply do not have money in the kitty, and debts are coming. This year, we paid $500 million US in January. Next month, in a couple of months' time, in June, we have to pay another 1,000 million sovereign bonds. And finding this money is a very, very difficult task at this stage. That is why we have to go back again with our begging bowl and to IMF, to India, to China, and all those countries, and look for some short-term relief. Let's assume we find some short-term relief. The question that we have to ask all of us as citizens, are we going to continue this from this onwards? Let's say we go through this crisis 2-3 years, somehow come out of this crisis, but that's not good enough. We always say we are a very educated nation, literacy rate is high, all the opportunities are there, geographically very well positioned. Then we have to do some structural adjustments at least now, and not repeat the mistakes that we continued government after government over the last couple of decades, and move forward with the right strategy. What do we have to do? We have to at least now take it upon ourselves to improve our exports. I told you exports have not been growing. Even now, just about $12 billion exports. Something that we must be ashamed of. If you look at that 12 billion exports, still we are talking about 4 main categories. One is apparel industry, which is giving us about $5 billion. But out of that $5 billion, 60% go back as raw material. So we actually get about, let's say, 2 billion or 2.5 billion from our number one export income generator. Then, what we were talking in 1950s, we are still talking. Tea, rubber, coconut. Formula hasn't changed. Composition hasn't changed. So we have to change this composition. Find out where we can make money and put our best foot forward and develop these industries. When you talk about your presentation, sir, you spoke about IT park. And I was amazed when you, in your presentation, said somebody at that time when you were talking about the IT park said, we don't need IT in this industry and we are developed enough. It is about, I think you were talking about 30 years ago, no? We are not developed enough. IT is our future. That is where our biggest potential lies. Their GDP has been growing at a rate over the last 10 years. They are soon going to be the third biggest GDP in the world. The service sector is what is bringing that GDP growth, and IT makes one of the biggest contributions. Our IT industry is still generating only about just over $1 billion. We have to take to do this to about at least 3 billion, 4 billion as fast as possible. This is something that we can do. So this is where we must make our maximum effort. How we are going to do that? I always say, in our current government, we have ministries for various subjects. We have Ministry for Milk, we have Ministry for Batik, we have Ministry for Clay, but only very recently we started focusing on IT and technology, and that is where the real focus has to come. The skills development, foreign remittances. Our biggest foreign inflow is from foreign remittances. 7 billion annually we were getting. Recently, the reason for this rupee flotation and all those things is remittances were coming down because this Undial system and other things. Now remittances, how do we increase? We can't be increasing these remittances by sending more and more our poor girls abroad to work in Middle Eastern countries as servants. We have to get into more skilled people. We have to send skilled people for foreign employment. So this is something that we are talking about even in our manifesto. But I'm sorry to say, even during the last 2 years, we haven't done much in that area. If you can send a trained nurse abroad, the trained nurse today in a European country can generate about $7,000, $8,000 a month. How much would a housemaid generate? $500, $600, $700? See the difference? Now we are actually starting our nursing university, hopefully this year. But even that is not fast enough. There are many other areas where we can focus and do these things. Then our tax policy. Obviously, our tax system has to be adjusted. Even the IMF report, which came out today, very clearly says we need to revisit our tax policy, bring our tax levels to a reasonable level. Of course, I was also one of the people who advocated reducing taxes and making it simplified in 2019. Why? Because at that time we had a huge tax problem in this country. The previous government had increased taxes overnight. In 2015, when they came to power, the tax to GDP ratio was 10%. They increased it to 13.5% in 1 year. Became a huge burden on businesses, particularly on small and medium sector businesses. They started struggling. And also, in addition to that, with the increased interest rates, starting from the infamous bond scam. On one side, increased interest rates, on one side high taxes, these businesses are getting wiped out. So we had to come and give some concession. So we proposed tax reduction, but we didn't necessarily propose what was actually given. The people who were responsible for that perhaps went overboard. 2% reduction in tax levels compared to GDP. Those are the mistakes. So at least now we need to correct. Actually, there was a bill that was passed 2 days ago to increase some of the taxes back. We have to do that. We have to bring the taxes to, let's say, at least 12%, 12.5% of GDP as fast as possible. Foreign investment. Foreign investment is key to solve this crisis. But how much foreign investment are we getting? We are getting, maximum I have saw for a year for the last 2 decades is, I think 2.5 billion a year. Usually we get about 1 billion or just over that. Recent past, not even $1 billion US. It is shameful when you look at countries around us. Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, India, Bangladesh, they are getting foreign direct investment much more than that. Then we need to find out why we are not getting that. Well, who is blocking these things? Is it corruption? Is it inefficiency? Is it the system? We know these things. We have known those things for so many years, but we are not correcting. So probably you need a separate ministry just to solve this problem, to bring foreign direct investment. You may ask, why am I talking about this when I'm in the government? But that doesn't, being in the government doesn't mean you are involved in economic management, because we have different responsibilities, as you very well know. I run urban development, so I can only comment. So I take every opportunity I get to comment, privately as well as publicly. We need to put things right. I hope every crisis in a way is an opportunity, because when you're in a crisis, you look at ways of getting out of the crisis. So everybody is now in a crisis. You are in a crisis. You don't have power. You don't have diesel. You don't have, your cost of living is going up. We are all in that crisis. So we all must now understand the problem of our country is an economic problem. So we need to now very seriously discuss what is the most appropriate economic policy for this country. So are we going to listen to rhetorics from morning till evening? I'm not going to go into detail what kind of rhetorics are we talking about. Or are we going to be sensible, use our brains and decide what kind of economic policies do we need? How we are going to generate money through our assets? Let's take the so-called national assets, protection on national assets. I'm always against selling national assets. I was against then, I'm against now. In late 90s, under Mr. R. Premadas and under Mrs. Chandrika Bandaranaike, a lot of national assets were sold. If I remember, Victor Evans' Chaura Rajya book gives a detailed description of these assets which were sold. They never were converted to business. They were just sold. The people who bought just grabbed the assets and disappeared. They were never converted to businesses. That is not what we should do. But there are a lot of assets even now in the government, state-owned enterprises, which are making losses, which are burden to the country. We need to find a way to make these things profitable. The only way you can make those things profitable by getting the private sector engaged, but by not by giving it to the private sector totally, but by doing what SLT did sometimes back, telecommunication. Get into a partnership, government private, keep government ownership partly, but bring private sector to manage. Bring the best skills to convert these businesses. These things we have to do. So we have to make people understand that these are decisions that we have to take. I mean, if somebody says, when a foreigner comes, buys a land and put up a building, start a business, we must not be crying and saying, we are selling our assets to foreigners. They are not going to take that land away. The land is going to be here. If a future government, if they want to nationalize, they can nationalize. So let's not worry about those things. Let us invite foreign direct investment. Let people come and start businesses. Bring money. So we have to change our mindset. So a lot of things we need to do over the next 2 to 3 years. I hope whatever the political party will come to this, understand this reality. We can fight each other, talk about different policies, but now no way out unless we get our economic policies right. That is why I, in a way, support this all-party conference. Maybe nothing will come out of that. But at least there's a discussion. There's an opportunity to challenge. There's an opportunity for opposition to challenge the government. Sometimes even within the government, we don't have that opportunity. We don't get that opportunity to challenge our other ministers unless you're in cabinet. They say sometimes even in the cabinet you can't do that. But at least these opportunities will give an opportunity for all parties to come and challenge. So I think other parties also should come. Make use of that opportunity. At least a discussion will start. People will understand. And I appeal to you as professionals, participate in this discussion. Learn about these things. Read the numbers. Beyond your profession, go and do some study. Then as professionals, you will be able to educate the other people. you will be able to educate the society. Unless we get the entire society, not only the professional, entire society politically literate, we can't get out of this crisis. Because it is politics which put us in this. Without understanding that properly, we can't get out of this. Thank you very much.